Anyway, not quite 2 years ago, we began to examine in these lectures Christian movements in the UK that have had a contribution to where churches of Christ in Britain are today. And as Patrick mentioned, the previous lessons is on BBS YouTube channel. If you want to search for my YouTube channel under Jon Galloway, it's on mine as well. But many have preconceived ideas that churches of Christ are largely a product of two influential men in the United States, and those men being Barton W. Stone and Alexander Campbell. And they cannot really conceive of any group believing as they do, yet not being started by them or those who they taught. As we pointed out in the last lecture, the problem with that view is that there were groups in the United Kingdom who predated not only when these two men began to teach in the early 19th century, but they were in existence years before they were even born. In Britain, what we find are numerous groups arising independently of each other, some springing up and a generation later were gone, but others continuing on. There are many people advocating a return to what the Bible said and rejecting any denominational ties or any additions or changes to God's word. People of like mind in an area would meet together for worship and for study, but it may seem strange to us that they were often unaware of any other groups who thought and believed as they did. And this is largely where the influence of Alexander Campbell comes in. As we saw in our first lecture, it was through Campbell's writing that people became aware of others who were advocating for return to the Bible and Christianity as described in the New Testament. Although we can safely say that congregations in the UK were not started as a result of the work of Campbell and Stone, we cannot say that Campbell in particular had no influence on what has happened in the UK. So, this is the story for tonight. What I'm hoping to do is to begin by looking at Campbell's early days in Ireland, what is now Northern Ireland, as well as the influence of his father, and then examine what influence the movements going on in Scotland that we talked about last time had on Campbell, and then look at Campbell's early days of preaching and teaching in the United States, which led to his writing, and then looking at his influence through his preaching and his visit to the UK and what influence he had there. So that's sort of a rough structure of where I want to go this evening. So anyway, to understand why someone thinks the way they do, it's useful to see what influences they had in their life. I don't think you can underestimate the influence of, particularly of parents on a child. I know that my father, a Bible student and preacher for his entire life in the United States and in Finland briefly, helped to form my core beliefs and my respect for the Bible. The same holds true for Alexander Campbell. Alexander's father was Thomas Campbell. Thomas was born on 1st of February 1763 in County Down, Ireland, what's now Northern Ireland. I couldn't determine from my limited resources on the life of Thomas Campbell in which town he was born. His grandfather, named Archibald, converted from Roman Catholicism to the Church of England and was a strict Anglican. Archibald's oldest son was also named Thomas, and at some point, Thomas's sons, Thomas, James, Archibald, and Enos, became part of the Secession Presbyterian Church, and they were anti-burghers. Now, we talked in our previous lecture about the Secession Church, which formed under Ebenezer Erskine and three others, and eventually divided into the burghers and the anti-burghers on whether burgesses could take an oath and be supported. And both of these further divided into the Old Lichs and the New Lichs on whether making the solemn league and covenant a condition of whether someone could take communion. Thomas had a very keen intellect and became a teacher. Initially teaching in Southern Ireland, now that's way below this map because this map is a map of County Down, but about 3 years down in Ireland before returning to County Down to teach in a school in Sheepbridge near Newry. The man who recommended him for this post, his name was John Kinley, was so impressed with Thomas that he offered to pay his expenses to train as a minister for the Seceder Church. Thomas traveled to Scotland to attend Glasgow University, as it looked there on the high street of Glasgow at that time period. And he attended there for 3 years. John Rennick, who I mentioned in the last lecture, some of you may have known John, was doing some research at Glasgow University, and he looked up in the archives but could not find Thomas's matriculation signature. But it said he studied there for 3 years, studied liberal arts, graduated with an honors degree. He then enrolled in a 5-year course in the Theological School of the Seceder Presbyterian Church in Whitburn and studied under A.B. Bruce. He completed the course, passing his examination on Latin, Greek, and various branches of philosophy, and was licensed to preach in the Seceder Church. Now, when you add that, that's 8 years, but it looks like he only spent about 4 or 5 years in Scotland. So I think they credited him with his 3 years of study in Glasgow. All that seems to have happened before his marriage, which would mean that he was in his late teens, probably, when he went to Glasgow University. He returned to County Down and began preaching near Sheepbridge. It's where he had been living. Thomas married Jane Cornegal somewhere around 1785 to 1787. And I say around because despite what some articles you read state dates as facts, the dates really cannot be nailed down with any precision. The reason being they lost the Campbell family records because there is a shipwreck, which we'll get to in a few minutes, off the coast of Islay. But they were married, and apparently Thomas was 25 and Jane was 24. They moved to County Armagh to the Rich Hill community. That's the Rich Hill community reasonably close to today that you see in the photograph. That's between Armagh and Portadown. Obviously, they didn't have any cars. Their first child to be born was Alexander. And again, born somewhere between 1781 and 1788 or 1789. Depends on who you read. Robert Richardson, Campbell's biographer, placed the date as 12th September 1788. And his son-in-law, W.K. Pendleton, said it was June 1786. Moses Lard, one of his students, placed it in 1787. Tolbert Fanning, based on a conversation he heard between Campbell and a chap named R.N. Johnson, placed it back in 1781. His father Thomas said it was June 1786. And that seems to be the date that the family agreed on, so that's the date I'm going to go with as well. Thomas became a minister of the Seceder Church in Ohori in County Armagh in 1798 and moved there, where he served for the next 10 years. He was an anti-burger Old Licht minister. Even in these early years, he was concerned about division amongst those who were trying to follow God. He tried unsuccessfully to heal the rift between the burghers and the anti-burghers. Apparently, from what I read, the Irish were willing, but the Scots were not. Alexander wrote about his efforts in his memoirs of Elder Thomas Campbell. And he said, when a student in the University of Glasgow, while returning home from church one day, I was interrogated by a gentleman accompanying me as to my parentage. On naming my father, he said, I listened to your father in our General Assembly in the city, pleading for a union between the burghers and anti-burghers. But, sir, while in my opinion, he clearly out-argued them, they outvoted him. So it gives you a little flavor of what Thomas' thinking was even at this stage. He was a devoted and active minister of the church in Ohori. Again, Thomas writes about him. He says, while a minister in connection with the Synod of Belfast, the pastor of the church in Ohori in the county of Armagh, we only express a prevailing public opinion when we say that he was the most earnest, indefatigable, and devoted minister in the presbytery and synod to which he belonged. In preaching, teaching, and visiting his charge, inculcating personal and family religion, he had certainly no superior, and so far as we could ascertain, no equal. His family training and discipline were peculiarly didactic, biblical, and strict. The Bible, with Brown's Catechism, was, during the minority of his family, a daily study and a daily recitation. He also instituted those customs in all the families of his congregation. His congregation at Ohori and the county of Armagh was therefore regarded as the best educated community in the presbytery of Market Hill, to which it belonged. Cite all that just to show you this is the world into which Alexander was born and raised. His family had a keen emphasis on reading and learning, both what we call the classics now, as well as the Bible, and it included memorizing large sections of both. Earl West wrote in the first volume of the Search for Ancient Order, it was the rule in the Campbell family that each child should sometime during the day memorize a verse of scripture to recite at evening worship. Almost daily, the boy studied the Bible along with Brown's Catechism. He memorized rich passages in Greek, Roman, French, and English literature. In later years, many marveled at the knowledge which Campbell possessed. As a result, Alexander had extensive knowledge of everything from the Reformation back to ancient history. In conversation, not only could he quote scripture, but also Milton and Shakespeare and Thompson and Young. He amazed people with his vast knowledge. Now, Thomas' influence especially extended to the Bible. Alexander would often see his father studying and spending time in two main books, the Bible and a concordance. Thomas ignored many books on his shelf as he turned more towards the Bible and away from the creeds and the teaching of men. This is what Alexander said about his father's influence on him. He said, "Are we living for time or are we living for eternity? This is a question which we should daily propound to ourselves, to which we should always be prepared to give an unambiguous and satisfactory answer. How, think we, shall we hereafter retrospect the use we have made of ourselves, of our means and opportunities of knowing and of doing good, of being happy and of making others happy by our instrumentality? Lord, teach us to consider this and to so number our days that we may apply our hearts to wisdom. And let the beauty of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the works of our hands upon us. Yea, the works of our hands establish thou it. So prayed Moses, the man of God, as reported in the 90th Psalm. Such were the teachings which I received in my early life from the subject of the following memoirs. And whatever good, little or much, I may have achieved under God, I owe it all, and those benefited by it owe it all, to his paternal care and instruction, especially to his example." So he acknowledged that he owed his father a great debt, and those that he had taught also owed Thomas a great debt. Thomas was not only the minister of the Seceder Church in Ohori, but he also established a school there to supplement his income. And this is the building that the school met in. In time, Alexander also taught at the school. But Thomas was afflicted with what Earl West called a stomach trouble. My guess is maybe ulcers or something like that. It gave him considerable pain. The doctors of the day could not help him. So they recommended a trip abroad to help him. Thomas decided to travel to America. Now, keep in mind, this was a very young country at this time. It's only been 30 years since the Declaration of Independence. So he decides he's going to go to America. Again, Thomas writes about that and says, owing to the delicacy of his health, his physicians urged him to take a sea voyage as the most promising, if not the only restorative of his innervated system. This was the occasion of his visiting the United States, purposing to return to Ireland should he not be pleased with the country. Several from Rich Hill had already immigrated to the United States, including Thomas' daughter and husband. Alexander had expressed plans to go when he was older. So Thomas sailed for 35 days, arrived in Philadelphia in 1807 in the early spring. So Alexander would have been around 21 years old. Let's leave Thomas there just for a minute. Let's pick up what the family's doing in Northern Ireland. In the meantime, they continued to live and work in Ohori. Alexander hadn't been able to complete his studies before Thomas left, so he continued them in Ireland. They finally heard from Thomas a year later in March 1808. He sent for them to hurry and join him. The family packed, but couldn't leave until September of that year because there was a smallpox epidemic. They set out for Londonderry on the 20th of September 1808, found a ship going to America, and they set sail on the 28th of September from Lough Foyle. But it took a while for the ship to get out. It was the 1st of October before they were underway. Apparently, the winds were not good at all. In fact, they still didn't make good headway due to the winds, which prevented them from leaving the loch. And when they did get to sea, they got blown to the island of Islay off the coast of Scotland, and the ship was wrecked. The area it went down in has had a considerable number of shipwrecks over the years. Earl West wrote that it was during this time of struggle to get going that Campbell spent his time in prayer and meditation, resulting in his decision to devote his life to God and to preaching. From Islay, they went up to and docked in Scotland and eventually made it to Glasgow. On 8th of November, 1808, Alexander began his studies at Glasgow University. John Rennick, when he's searching through the archives, did find his matriculation signature. I've got a copy of it somewhere, but could not find it. It's not digital yet. But like his father Thomas, he studied at the old campus near the cathedral in Glasgow, which was replaced by the current university buildings in 1870 when they needed the site for a train depot. Alexander studied Greek and logic and belles lettres, or lettres, I have no idea what that is, and experimental philosophy. He came into contact with much of the thought that was going on in Scotland at the time. The common sense school of Scottish philosophy seems to have made an impact on him. He also came into contact with the independent church movements, and we discussed those in our last lecture. He met Greville Ewing, who's on the right here, who was connected with the Haldane brothers. That's James Alexander Haldane on the left. And he became a very close friend of Alexander's. Greville did. We don't know if he actually had contact with the Haldane brothers, but through Greville Ewing, he was introduced to their ideas. It was his contact with Greville Ewing that seemed to have influenced him towards the idea of congregation independence. And all this came to a head when the semi-annual communion service rolled around near the end of his time in Glasgow. The custom was that all who were to partake of communion were given tokens after they'd been examined to prove that they were worthy. As Campbell had no recommendation from Ireland, he was examined by the elders, and he was shown to be worthy. But this caused him to think more about the idea of communion being closed, being restricted. When it came time on the Lord's Day for the Lord's Supper, he refused to partake, simply put his token into the plate. If anything, that was his signal that he was leaving the Seceder Church. His time in Glasgow added to what he learned from his father. Winfred Garrison wrote, this year in Glasgow proved to be very important. It brought him into contact with the men from whom, as his biographer Richardson says, he derived his first impulse as a religious reformer. These were representatives of the movement led and financed by the brothers Robert and James Alexander Haldane. Alexander Campbell came to Glasgow with a letter of introduction to Mr. Greville Ewing, who was in charge of the seminary or training school for lay preachers, which the Haldanes had established in that city. Ewing had introduced into his seminary the books of Glass and Sandeman, whose teachings gave the strongest possible emphasis to the restoration of primitive Christianity in all details. In Ewing's conversation in Glass's and Sandeman's books, Alexander Campbell found not only the general concept of a needed restoration of primitive Christianity, but such specific ideas as these: the independence of the local congregation, weekly observance of the Lord's Supper, a plurality of elders, the denial of clerical privileges and dignities, the right and duty of laymen to have a part in the edification and discipline of the church, and a conception of faith as such a belief of testimony as any man is capable of by the application of his natural intelligence to the facts supplied by Scripture. The Campbell family left Glasgow for Greenock on the 31st of July, 1809. They sailed 4 days later on the ship Latonia for New York, and they arrived in New York on the 29th of September. The next week found them in Philadelphia, and from there they began to travel across Pennsylvania to Washington, where Thomas was living. Now, going back to Thomas, back in 1807, when he docked in Philadelphia, the Presbyterian Synod of North America was in conference. He presented his credentials, was assigned to work in Western Pennsylvania. That's why he ended up out there. But the problem for Thomas was the Bible. He was reading it, and he was trying to apply it. Earl West writes, a man who reads the Bible with an open and intelligent mind will sooner or later absorb much to make him dissatisfied with the human elements in religion. That man, if he has faith and courage, will dare to speak out sooner or later against what is wrong. As Campbell filled his appointments, he found himself teaching things contrary to the creed of the church, but things which he felt were in harmony with the Scriptures. It was only a matter of time until earnest opposition would arrive. The first accusation against Thomas surfaced in October 1807. He was accused of being a teacher of false doctrine because he taught there were no human authorities, or there no divine authority for creeds, confessions, and faith, that they're simply human. This resulted in his appointments being canceled and eventually being suspended as a minister in the Seceder Church, although the synod later, when he appealed, upheld his appeal. Next September, when the local presbytery met, Thomas once again had no preaching assignments and was again charged with falsehood. He was suspended as a minister, and this was his formal separation with the Seceder Church. It's placed on the 13th of September, 1808. Thomas saw the problem with division and human creeds. He had friends who sympathized with his line of thought, and they held a meeting to discuss what they believed. And it was at that meeting that Thomas used the phrase, where the Bible speaks, we speak. Where the Bible is silent, we are silent. On 17th of August, 1809, so almost a year later, they formed what they called the Christian Association of Washington, Pennsylvania, that is, not as a church, but as a society for the promotion of Christian unity. A log cabin was built on a farm 3 miles from Mount Pleasant, going towards Washington. It was used as a school as well, with Campbell being the teacher. The next month, 7th September 1809, Thomas presented what we now know as his Declaration and Address to the group. Earl West wrote about it. He says Campbell's plan for unity was, in brief, a restatement in different words of Rupertus Maldinius's famous maxim: in essentials unity, in non-essentials liberty, in all things charity. Campbell used the terms faith and opinion. Unity, Campbell believed, could be realized upon the express teachings of the Bible, and in opinions, there should be liberty. Now, all that was happening while the rest of the family had been shipwrecked, and Alexander was studying in Glasgow. After docking in New York, they made their way towards where Thomas had settled, almost a month after the Declaration and Address. Obviously, both father and son had much to tell each other when they met. Both had changed their religious positions and had arrived at the same beliefs, but through different experiences and different paths. Christian unity was foremost on the minds of both men, but it had to be based on the truth of God's word. As West wrote, there was one object always before the man, and that was truth. He wanted the truth more than he wanted anything else. In Campbell's search for truth, he made the Bible the ultimate source of all his authority. He loved to study the word itself, and it can be safely said that few men ever attained to the knowledge which he had of the divine word. Sorry, went back the wrong direction there. They built a meeting house in the valley of Brush Run near Buffalo Creek. Alexander delivered his first lesson there on the 16th of September, 1810. 1811, he married Margaret Brown. Margaret's father was a successful businessman, living on a farm where he had a sawmill and a grist mill. He built a house known locally as the Mansion. When their daughter Jane was born in 1812, Alexander began investigating the subject of baptism, and in particular, infant baptism. His conclusion? He couldn't find anything in Scripture about it. So he began making plans to be immersed. And 7 ended up being immersed on the 12th of June, 1812, in a deep pool in Buffalo Creek. Before very long, the entire congregation at Brush Run had been immersed. Although they soon allied with the Redstone Baptist Association, by 1815, Alexander was not satisfied with being part of the Baptists, basically declared himself as an independent, although they were still part of the Redstone Association. In 1816, he delivered what we now know as a Sermon on the Law at a meeting of the Redstone Association, which emphasized that Christians were under the New and not the Old Testament. His speaking that day was not scheduled, but he was filling in because the scheduled speaker had gotten sick. And he ended up being charged by some with heresy, although no proceedings were started against him. He left the Redstone Association in 1823 when they're about to take action against him, and they became part of the Mahoning Association. The United States at that time was experiencing a push towards the West, which at this time was Ohio. The entire Brush Run Church made the decision they should all move to Zanesville, Ohio. Now, Campbell's father-in-law was not too thrilled with this, because he did not want to lose his daughter and his granddaughter. So he induced Campbell to stay by offering him his mansion and the farm that went with it for $1. Campbell accepted it, and so became a landowner in Virginia. This is a photograph of the mansion I took back in 2003. It differed from most houses of the late 1700s in this area because it was not built for fortification, particularly against Indians. It was built as a house to live in, a big house to live in. It's a beautiful house inside and out. It's fixed up inside with period furniture, and you can tour it today in Bethany, West Virginia. And so it's that's where he ended up living and raising his family. He also built for himself a study out in the grounds, just very near the house. I'm told that his study is an octagonal shaped light coming in from the top. As you can see, most likely the trees would not have been quite that big at that point in time. I understand he didn't add that little extension to the right until later. And that was when he's getting older, and he had no heating in the place, no place to burn a fire. And we got very cold, and he's got older. That was a problem. So he built this extension, which had a place where he had a fireplace in it where he could burn wood. Alexander's style of preaching was different from the orators and preachers of that time. And this, by the way, is a photograph inside the Bethany Church of Christ meeting place, and the subsequent photos inside the building will be from the time I visited there. But Campbell's style was simply to stand. He didn't walk around. He made very few gestures. He spoke in a conversational tone of voice. Archibald MacLean wrote a book called Alexander Campbell as a Preacher, and he said Mr. Campbell's style was his own. He did not aim to copy any of the famous orators of ancient or modern times. One of the strong pioneer preachers of Kentucky told him that he was surprised to find in him an entire want of gesture and mannerism, that he talked as men commonly talk. Mr. Campbell told him that he had studied the arts of elocution, but had conscientiously refrained from making any use of them. And that continued to be his style of speaking throughout his life. He goes on to say, we have known him in his prime. This is Isaac Errett said of him, we've known him in his prime stand for 2 hours leaning on a cane and talk in true conversational style with scarce a gesture in the entire discourse. But to a fine personal appearance and dignity of manner, he added a clearness of statement, a force of reasoning, a purity and sometimes a pomp of diction, a wealth of learning, a splendor of imagination, and an earnestness often rising into impassioned utterance, which clothed his pulpit efforts with a high degree of oratorical excellence. And this influenced those he taught. And because, especially when he later on started Bethany College and was training preachers, they admired him so much that, as MacLean goes on to say, there's a tradition in Bethany to the effect that when the students went out to preach, they carried canes and leaned on them while speaking. In his later years, Mr. Campbell wore a long patriarchal beard. The students encouraged their beards to grow long. So sort of a idolization of Alexander by his students. But I'm jumping a bit ahead of our story. The point is that Campbell not only became a good communicator through his speaking, but he was a popular speaker to the extent that many American dignitaries heard him and wrote about what a good speaker he was, including Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, Jeremiah Sullivan Black, who's Chief Justice of Pennsylvania. Even James Madison, President of the United States, heard Campbell speak. When he spoke for what we would consider a long period of time. When at his usual congregation, he would speak for an hour to an hour and a half. That's the congregation here in Bethany. If he spoke away or on special occasions, it'd be twice that long. He would often speak 2 or 3 times during a day. Campbell says, or MacLean says, the length of his sermons was in harmony with the customs of the time and barely met the expectations and wishes of the people. They were hungry and wanted a full meal. His biographer states that minutes became seconds, hours became minutes. The people were so entranced that they were unaware of the lapse of time. A noted Baptist minister said to a friend at the close of one of Mr. Campbell's sermons that it was a little hard to ride 30 miles to hear a man preach 30 minutes. His friend said, "It's been longer than that. Look at your watch." On looking, he found that it had been 2 hours and a half. He said, 2 hours of my time are gone, and I know not how. though wide awake all the time. That was no uncommon experience, McLean says. The people were so engrossed with the great theme under consideration that they forgot all else. He also did not speak from notes, but due to his extensive study and his great mind, he was still able to present a logical, well thought out lesson without writing anything down. In fact, McLean says, while making the most conscientious preparation for the pulpit, he wrote but little. Writing sermons was exceedingly irksome and distasteful to him. At that time, newspapers were not as numerous and as enterprising as now. Reporters were not as ubiquitous nor as accomplished. Because of these facts, few of Mr. Campbell's sermons have been published. Only 2 or 3 have been preserved, and these are not verbatim reports. So we have very little of what he actually preached, but we do know how he did it a bit from those who heard him. In Campbell's early days, religious debates held no attraction to him. It is said that they were particularly odious to him because he believed they created more division and were usually engaged in for personal victory rather than a victory for truth. Nevertheless, he did become involved in debating. There was a Baptist preacher who heard Campbell and wanted him to debate a Presbyterian on the subject of baptism. Campbell ignored the letters, he was sent, but finally, after being asked again and again and again, he agreed to his first debate in June of 1820 on the mode of baptism. At the close of that debate, Campbell challenged any minister of any denomination to debate with him on infant baptism. This led to a number of debates on various topics, including baptism, Christian evidences, Roman Catholicism, and the Holy Spirit. Earl West says, by now Campbell was convinced that debating was really valuable. Throngs of people had come to hear him. His reputation as a speaker was spread far and wide. Campbell could now see that debate was worthwhile. Indeed, these 2 debates, the first 2, convinced Campbell that a week's debating is worth a year's preaching. And these debates that Campbell was involved in were published in book form, and they received a very wide readership. He had more than 4 published, so those are the 4 that I have in my collection of books. West writes, the published debate with Walker, that's the first one, had taught him the power of the press to disseminate his views. So he began thinking of printing a paper. Campbell bought the type, presses, etc., and erected a building near the creek fording at the base of the cemetery hill. Here he began publication of the Christian Baptist, the first issue of which appeared August 3rd, 1823. In the pages of the Christian Baptist, Campbell called for a return to the ancient order of things, to get rid of creeds, confessions of faith, and authoritative councils. He pled for a return to what we read about in the New Testament. This paper made many friends, but also made many enemies. He published the Christian Baptist until the close of 1829, just over 6 years, and he then began a paper that he called the Millennial Harbinger, the first issue appearing on January 4th, 1830. It was in his writing that Alexander Campbell had an influence on what was already happening in the British Isles. It was in 1830 that a Haldane congregation in Octomukty sent one of their own to visit Campbell in Bethany, Virginia, now West Virginia. They heard of Campbell undoubtedly through his writings that were being published in the United Kingdom. An independent congregation in Dungannon, Ireland was started in 1804. They learned of Alexander Campbell and began corresponding with him, received his writing, and began to teach these principles in England and Scotland as well. By the late 1830s, Campbell's writings were being reproduced in the UK, both his magazine articles and his books. A.C. Waters, in the History of the British Churches of Christ, said, of great influence, too, in guiding the thought of the young brotherhood were the works of Alexander Campbell, and particularly his compact volume, The Christian System. Practically every problem that could arise amongst the churches had been discussed by him within its pages, and his views were well studied. The Christian Messenger and Reformer was a magazine in Britain that was started by James Wallace in 1837. And as you can see from the first opening page there, it contained essays, addresses, orations, letters, etc., by Alexander Campbell and others. Now, James Wallace was from Nottingham. Uh, he had withdrawn from the Scotch Baptists in 1836 with others to form a Church of Christ in Nottingham. And besides, when he began publishing this magazine, besides articles, it also contained correspondence from congregations, some from the United States, others from the UK. An issue that I looked at from 1839 had a letter from Jacksonville, Illinois in it, and a letter from Newcastle on Tyne. So it was a magazine, but not just republishing what Campbell wrote, but taking those articles and putting them into a magazine for people in Britain. By 1840, more writers were from the UK, and the subheading was changed, that it was now devoted to the dissemination of primitive Christianity. And that name changed again slightly in 1845, became the Christian Messenger and Family magazine. In 1848, Wallace changed the name to the British Millennial Harbinger and Family magazine, clearly being influenced by the name of Campbell's publication. In 1861, due to failing health, James Wallace handed the magazine to David King, who had assisted Wallace for many years. By this time, the Christians in the UK were less reliant on the writings of Campbell and others from the United States. His first issue, David King said this: "The readers of the British Millennial Harbinger know to what it is devoted. A single number will suffice to acquaint a stranger with our position. It may, however, be said that it no longer exists mainly for the purpose of reproducing the thoughts of brethren who labor in distant lands, though we still realize pleasure and profit by reprinting emanations from the pen of Alexander Campbell and others, to whom we are greatly indebted. Yet apart from this, the churches in Great Britain require a channel of communication and an instrument to reach those who deviate from the old way. Brethren here speak through its pages, and now several publications in the United States reprint the work of their pens, thus enabling us to commence repayment of the large obligations due to those by whom the productions of the first volumes were written." I thought that was interesting what he wrote in his first editorial, that he said, yeah, we were indebted to those from the United States and we published their articles, but now they're starting to publish our articles because we're now doing the writing. And from then on, really the bulk of the writing in the paper was from British writers. This photograph here, James Wallace, as you see him there, his name labeled on him, and David King sitting beside him. And I also mentioned Gilbert Tickle in the back. I know who the rest are as well, but I'm not going to mention them at this point. But mentioning Tickle because we're going to quote from him later. But Wallace and King, they're working together to publish the British Millennial Harbinger. Now, King changed the name to the British Harbinger with the first edition of 1866. And the reason they dropped millennial was many were starting to ignore the magazine, thinking it was connected to the premillennial movement. In 1871, he changed the name to the Ecclesiastical Observer. And you can just see maybe under Observer, formerly the British Harbinger. It was announced by David King in the final issue of the British Harbinger in December 1870. He said the British Harbinger then will appear on the 1st of January and continue monthly at the same price, but under a new title. Henceforth, it will be known as the Ecclesiastical Observer. It's well known that the present title is none of our selecting, has only been retained because we could not see the way open to get rid of it. In its former shape, the Millennial Harbinger, it was misleading, and in its present, it is indefinite. Several titles have been suggested, but hardly a second person among those we could consult was found to approve any one of them, with the exception of the one adopted. The Ecclesiastical Observer was continued to be published until 1889. In 1890, another name change to the Bible Advocate. It was a merger of two of King's publications, the Christian Advocate and the Ecclesiastical Observer. But once again, I'm straying from where I need to be. I'm fringing on a lecture for future years. But suffice it to say, Alexander Campbell's influence of Christians in Great Britain wasn't in his preaching or in starting congregations. It was in his writing, and his writings being reproduced in magazines in this country. Now, Campbell did make a visit to the UK in 1847. James Wallace published an appeal in the Christian Messenger to raise funds toward the expenses to bring Campbell to the UK. Within a few weeks, 27 congregations sent £170 with promises for more funds. Campbell arrived. He was very well received. He spoke in large halls, which had been rented for the purpose, and there were good audiences. His itinerary was so full he couldn't stay long in any one place. There's an article in the first edition of the British Millennial Harbinger by someone who heard Campbell's first public lecture in Edinburgh. He wrote, "Sanguine as our anticipations were of the reception which Mr. Campbell would meet with from the citizens of modern Athens, we confess we were not prepared for the demonstration which was made in his favor when he delivered his first public lecture in the large Waterloo Room on Lord's Day evening, the 16th of August last. The large hall, which is capable of containing upwards of 2,000 of an audience, was crowded to complete suffocation on the occasion, and we believe hundreds left without admission." I think we can see that he was popular when he arrived. The reporter, by the way, his name's not in the article, I don't know who it is, believed that the reason for the large audience was because Campbell had a high moral and an intellectual reputation, as could be seen in the quality of his publications, as well as the popularity of his lectures elsewhere. It seems that Campbell's writings were being disseminated into the population of Edinburgh. This reporter went on to say, "Although the great majority of our brethren may not know it, yet we can fully assure them that the works of Alexander Campbell of Virginia are extensively read by the reading public of Edinburgh and many other parts of Scotland. We might also say that he has already secured for himself a cosmopolitan fame, for his name and efforts in the cause of religious truth are beginning to be known almost to every denomination in Christendom." He mentioned in particular his published debates, which he said had been extensively read and highly appreciated. And this, he said, was the true reason that multitudes flocked to hear Mr. Campbell. The article goes ahead to report in a few pages what Campbell spoke on in that first lecture. The lecture was entitled Christ, the Oracle of God, and he gives sort of an outline, a sketch of what he spoke on. Obviously, it wasn't the full 2 hours because that would have gone on for pages and pages, but he gave a summary of what he said in that particular lecture. But it was not all to be smooth sailing. It was after a meeting with three men from three congregations in Kirkcaldy who came down to Edinburgh. These three congregations couldn't get along. After that meeting, placards, one reproduced there on the screen, began appearing in Edinburgh, accusing Campbell of being the abettor of an upholder of men stealers, that he had been a slaveholder himself, although he no longer was. It turns out that one of the men from Kirkcaldy that met with him was also working with the Anti-Slavery Society of Edinburgh. In Kirkcaldy, where he went next, Campbell spoke. It's believed he spoke here in the Rose Street Chapel. It's said that he spoke for 3 hours, 1 hour on faith, 1 hour on hope, and 1 hour on charity or love. It was the result of Campbell's visit to Kirkcaldy that the Rose Street congregation gave up calling themselves Baptists. They were Scotch Baptists, and they became Christians only. They changed the name on the building to Christian Meeting House. The next day, 6 men in Kirkcaldy met with him to discuss American slavery. He returned to Edinburgh, and there was an increasing clamor on the topic of slavery, which continued throughout his tour of Scotland. James Robertson of Edinburgh ended up taking out an action for defamation against Alexander Campbell for £5,000 of damages. And Campbell ended up being imprisoned in Glasgow in the women's prison. The reason he sued him for defamation was Campbell had issued a response to the previous one, and he said that he would debate Richardson. That's what he's asking for, as long as it wasn't the Richardson who had violated the fifth commandment by not taking care of his mother. And he said, I don't know if it's this guy or not. Well, this guy took offense at it, sued him. He ended up in prison. Campbell went on trial, found not guilty, acquitted, and Robertson was charged, tried, and convicted of false imprisonment and fined £2,000. That would have been a lot of money in the 1840s. He paid the first installment of £40, and then he fled from Scotland to France, never to be heard of again. Let me close our discussion of Alexander Campbell's influence on the developing Christian movement in the UK with this statement made by Gilbert Tickle in a letter to Selina Campbell after her husband's death in 1866. Tickle wrote, "The brethren could not but feel with real and painful interest the loss that had descended upon the churches and the world in the removal of your distinguished husband from the scene of his long-continued and heroic labors, who had swayed during that time such a pure and lofty influence over the true-hearted of both hemispheres, and whose single-hearted devotion to the work of restoring a pure and uncorrupted Christianity to the world had fired so many hearts with the same ambition." There's a whole lot more that could be said about Campbell and his life and his teaching and what he believed, but I've tried to limit the information on Campbell to what was necessary to establish his influence among Christians in the UK. There's many works that you can read to learn more about Campbell's life, as well as reading the books that he wrote, the magazines that he published, the debates to which he contributed. Most of these can be found free online. I found a lot of them online. That's where I did some of my research. If you have further interest in the history of Christians and congregations in the UK, I hope to have more lectures on this in the future. As I was preparing this one, I thought it'd be nice to know more about James Wallace. That may be a step too far, but I intend to try it. Definitely I want to do a lecture on David King, and as well as something that keeps cropping up in some of the reading I'm doing, and that is how the practices of British congregations developed differently from those in the United States. But that's all for another day. So thank you for joining us.